Chapter 26. A Bad Bargain. In this vile world, everything is true or false according to the color of the glass through which you view it. Calderón de la Barca. Throughout the rest of 1967 and well into 1968, Josselson found himself in a state of mental and physical exhaustion, daily reminded of the confusion and bitterness his actions had occasioned. It is inconceivable for me how anyone who believed in freedom, in the open society, in the moral correspondence between means and ends, could have thought it proper to accept funds from an agency of international espionage, wrote Jaya Prakash Narayan, chairman of the Indian Congress for Cultural Freedom. It was not enough to assess that the Congress had always functioned with independence. The agency was only doing what it must have considered useful for itself. One writing to announce he was quitting the Indian office, K.K. Sinha said, "Had I any idea that there was a time bomb concealed in the Paris headquarters, I would not have touched the Congress." For some, there were real explosives to be dealt with. In Japan, one Congress activist's house was firebombed, and he had to seek police protection. In Uganda, Rajat Nyogi, the editor of Transition, had no sooner deduced that the damage to his magazine would be incalculable than he was arrested and imprisoned. There were real victims, said Diana Josselson, and Michael felt anguish, remorse, and, at times, he questioned his judgment for going along with things at all. We wavered over the Jesuitical line of the ends justifying the means, but in the end we agreed it had been the right thing to do. But the real damage to people's reputations anguished him terribly. There were people in India, in the Lebanon, in Asia, in Africa, men and women who cast their lot in with the Congress on the strength of representations that I, Mike, and others made, who then found themselves caught in the hurricane, said John Hunt. And I know many of them suffered deeply, and no amount of high strategy, moralizing, or discussion will make that fact go away. They put their honor and life on the line, and I haven't forgotten that. You can't override the moral dilemma by using phrases like raison d'etat, or the cunning of history, or whatever. But I'd do it all over again if I had the chance. You can have regrets and still say it was all worthwhile. For in Europe and America, far from what K.K. Sinha called the din of the advancing threat, reactions were mixed. Michael Polanyi found the fuss around the CIA revelations contemptible and said, "I would have served the CIA, had I known of its existence, in the years following the war, with pleasure." Pfeiffer described it merely as a storm in a teacup, which would blow over. Yehudi Menuhin thought much more of the CIA for associating with people like us. 6 George Kennan, predictably, issued a ringing defense, saying that the flap about CIA money was quite unwarranted and caused far more anguish than it should have been permitted to cause. I never felt the slightest pangs of conscience about it. This country has no Ministry of Culture, and CIA was obliged to do what it could to try to fill the gap. It should be praised for having done so, and not criticized. So the idea that the CIA's involvement in the cultural life of the West could be rationalized as a necessary evil of democracy found increasingly few supporters. Writing of a deeper sense of moral disillusionment, Andrew Kopkind argued that the distance between the rhetoric of the open society and the reality of control was greater than anyone thought. Everyone who went abroad for an American organization was, in one way or another, a witness to the theory that the world was torn between communism and democracy, and anything in between was treason. The illusion of dissent was maintained. The CIA supported socialist Cold Warriors, fascist Cold Warriors, black and white Cold Warriors. The Catholicity and flexibility of CIA operations were major advantages, but it was a sham pluralism, and it was utterly corrupting. 8. This position, much repeated, was attractive for its moral simplicity, but it was too simple. The real point was not that the possibility of dissent had been irrevocably damaged. Kopkind's own arguments were witness to that, or that intellectuals had been coerced or corrupted, though that may have happened too, but that the natural procedures of intellectual inquiry had been interfered with. What most irritated us, wrote Jason Epstein, was that the government seemed to be running an underground gravy train whose first-class compartments were not always occupied by first-class passengers. The CIA and the Ford Foundation, among other agencies, had set up, and were financing an apparatus of intellectuals selected for their correct Cold War positions as an alternative to what one might call a free intellectual market, where ideology was presumed to count for less than individual talent and achievement, and where doubts about established orthodoxies were taken to be the beginning of all inquiry. It had at last become clear how bad a bargain the intellectuals had made, that it could never have been in the interest of art or literature, of serious speculation of any kind, or even of humanity itself, for them to serve the will of any nation. 9. Do you think I would have gone on the Encounter payroll in 1956-7 had I known there was secret U.S. government money behind it? Dwight MacDonald angrily asked Josselson in March 1967. If you do, we are really out of contact. One would hesitate to work even for an openly government-financed magazine. I think I've been played for a sucker. 10 suckers or hypocrites? Despite rubbing up against the front office Metternichs when they had axed his article in 1958, MacDonald had had no hesitation in asking Josselson in 1964 if he could employ his son Nick for the summer. This, at a time when anybody who was anybody had at least heard rumors connecting the Congress to the CIA. And what about Spender, who in the summer of 1967 broke down in tears at a party in Evanston, Chicago, when fellow guests responded ungenerously to his protestations of innocence? There they all were, like so many David Levine caricatures. Daniel Bell and his wife Pearl Cousin Bell, Richard Ellman, Hannah Arendt, Stephen Spender, Tony Tanner, Saul Bellow, Harold Rosenberg, Mrs. Polanyi, recalled one of the less famous guests. They had all been involved with the Congress in some way or another. After the spaghetti, they all angrily engaged in calling each other naive for not having known who their backers really were and for not passing the information on to the rest. I never trusted Irving, said Hannah Arendt. She said the same thing about Melvin Lasky. Daniel Bell busily defended both his friends. The argument became more and more fierce. Spender began to weep. He had been used, misled, knew nothing, never had. Some guests were heard to say Stephen was being naive. Others seemed to think he was just faux naif. 11 Stephen was very upset, said Stuart Hampshire. People have been very mean about Stephen, saying he must have known. I don't think he did. Maybe he didn't try too hard to find out, but he didn't really know anything about government or intelligence. 12 Lawrence de Neufville, however, recalled things differently. I know people who knew he knew, but you can't blame him for denying it, because everything we did had to be plausibly denied, so he could very well plausibly deny it. Josselson knew that Spender had been told, and he told me so. My attitude on hearing of Spender and his wounded sensibilities after it all blew up, and maybe this is colored by my sense of guilt, was that he had to have known, said Tom Braden, and I think he did know. 14 Natasha Spender, who always protested her husband's innocence, concluded mournfully that his was the role of Prince Mishkin in The Idiot. Suckers or hypocrites? When Tom Braden was shown Partisan Review's famous statement on the CIA, drafted by William Phillips and published in summer 1967, he laughed out loud. We would like to make public our opposition to the secret subsidization by the CIA of literary and intellectual publications and organizations, and our conviction that regular subsidization by the CIA can only discredit intellectually and morally such publications and organizations, read the statement. We lack confidence in the magazines alleged to have been subsidized by the CIA, and we do not think they have responded appropriately to the questions that have been raised. Looking at the signatories, 17 in all, including Hannah Arendt, Paul Goodman, Stuart Hampshire, Dwight MacDonald, William Phillips, Richard Poirier, Philip Rov, William Styron, and Angus Wilson, Braden said simply, of course they knew. Perhaps James Farrell had been right when he said that those partisan review people fear clarity as the devil does holy water. From Geneva's Plateau du Champel, a residential square whose silence was broken once a week when the vegetable market arrived, Josselson could only watch bitterly as the Congress, now renamed the International Association for Cultural Freedom, moved on without him under its new director, Shepard Stone. For the first year, John Hunt was retained, at Shepard Stone's invitation, to help with the budget. Initially, Josselson would call his former second lieutenant every day. He would say, "Let's do this," or "Let's do that," Hunt remembered. And I would say, "Listen, Mike, Shep's in charge now." It was very sad. Mike was going on as if nothing had really changed. Josselson was a rather tragic character. Stephen Spender said, "I think that he was in the position of an ambassador who stays in a country too long, and instead of representing the people who've sent them there, starts representing the people to whom he sent, which is why ambassadors are never allowed to stay too long in countries, because they tend to switch in this way." And I think that this kind of switch happened with Josselson. If view the whole thing as a kind of operation, Josselson was the godfather, and he really loved us all. And he was also an extremely cultivated man who cared greatly about literature and music and so on. But he also was a bullying and domineering person who took his responsibilities frightfully seriously and was not at all frivolous about it. He was really broken, I think, when the whole thing was exposed. Shepard Stone, the Ford Foundation executive who had brokered millions of dollars of philanthropic funds for the Congress, had been Josselson's candidate for his successor, but, according to Diana, Michael soon realized it was a mistake. Michael was retained as a consultant, and the Congress being Michael's life, he wrote many memos, but they were not answered. It was difficult for Shep because he didn't want to be Michael's boy, his figurehead, but it wasn't done in a very elegant way. Michael disagreed with things that he did, such as peeling off the country and regional associations that weren't of interest to him. In other words, India, Australia, anything that wasn't European. Shep had no feeling for this at all. He hadn't been there, so those guys were just out. He revealed a profound lack of understanding of intellectuals. When presentations were made year after year to the Ford Foundation for funds, Shep would ask Michael to do it because he wasn't capable of doing it himself. Now financed entirely by the Ford Foundation, the Congress had apparently achieved the independence which had eluded Josselson. Yet, according to John Hunt, behind the scenes there was a bitter contest between the British, French, and American secret services to secure leadership of the organization in that summer of 1967. The fear was always that one of these organizations in which there'd been an American involvement in the beginning would be taken over by a friendly service, he explained. The thinking was that the callow, dumb, quiet Americans will go on putting up the money, and we Europeans will put up the brains, and we'll have a perfect, tidy operation, and we'll run it. In the end, everyone got a slice. The Americans got their candidate in as president and chief executive. Shepard Stone's entire career, from the High Commission in Germany to the Ford Foundation, and now the Congress, was littered with intelligence connections. In his memoirs, the East German spymaster Marcus Wolf alleged that Stone was a CIA case officer. The French inserted their man Pierre Emmanuel, whose affiliations to the Deuxième Bureau had long been rumored, as director. And the British, a while later, got their man in as co-director. He was Adam Watson, the SES CIA liaison in Washington in the early 1950s, the psychological warfare expert who had coordinated the Information Research Department's secret relationship with the Congress for Cultural Freedom. Everything had changed, but nothing had really changed. Nothing, except for the rivalries and tensions which Josselson could rightly flatter himself he had contained for so many years. The bitchiness and friability of temperament inherent in all intellectual conclaves now came to dominate an organization which had lost the elan and sense of purpose which had made it so prominent at the height of the Cold War. From Geneva, Josselson could do nothing to stop the reconstituted Congress from sailing towards its own oblivion. Nabokov wrote occasionally with news, dismissing its new masters as les compères. Equally disparaging was Edward Shills, who broke with the organization in 1970. It was, he said, utterly discredited, a mere chatfest for complacent, overfed intellectuals. In another letter to Josselson, he wrote that he had no news of the Congress, though he had received an invitation to meet some leading goyim, to which his response was a flat refusal. He shared with Sidney Hook an impression of Stone as a bumbling jackass, a fool enjoying a position and perquisites completely undeserved. The only thing Stone understood about world affairs, said Shills, was how to work an expense account. But the question that most troubled Shills, and which, he said, he would never be able to answer was how the communists, for all their evil deeds, had managed to command and keep the moral high ground. With the old nomenclatura no longer interested in its activities, and having lost the interest of its backers, the International Association for Cultural Freedom finally voted to dissolve itself in January 1979. In 1959, George Kennan had written to Nabokov that he could think of no group of people who have done more to hold our world together in these last years than you and your colleagues. In this country in particular, few will ever understand the dimensions and the significance of your accomplishments. For decades, Kennan remained convinced that the articles of faith upon which he had helped design the Pax Americana were the right ones. But in 1993, he renounced the monist credo upon which this had rested, saying, "I should make it clear that I'm wholly and emphatically rejecting any and all messianic concepts of America's role in the world. Rejecting, that is, an image of ourselves as teachers and redeemers to the rest of humanity. Rejecting the illusions of unique and superior virtue on our part, the prattle about manifest destiny or the American century." It was upon this proposition that it was America's destiny to assume responsibility for the century in place of a worn-out, discredited Europe that the central myths of the Cold War had been built. And it was, in the end, a false construct. The Cold War is a delusionary struggle between real interests, Harold Rosenberg had written in 1962. The joke of the Cold War is that each of the rivals is aware that the other's idea would be irresistible if it were actually put into practice. The West wants freedom to the extent that freedom is compatible with private ownership and with profits. The Soviets want socialism to the extent that socialism is compatible with the dictatorship of the communist bureaucracy. In fact, revolutions in the 20th century are for freedom and socialism. A realistic politics is essential, a politics which would get rid once and for all of the fraud of freedom versus socialism. 28. With these words, Rosenberg damned the Manichaean dualism by which the two sides had locked themselves into a convulsive pas de deux, caught in the despotism of formulae. Milan Kundera once attacked the man of conviction and asked, "What is conviction? It is a thought that has congealed. That is why a novelist must systematically desystemize his thought, kick at the barricade that he himself has erected around his ideas." Only then, said Kundera, would the wisdom of uncertainty emerge. The legacy of the 1967 revelations was a kind of uncertainty, but one which fell short of Kundera's wisdom. It was an uncertainty cultivated to obscure what had happened, or to minimize its impact. Disgusted by what he saw as the lack of accountability amongst those intellectuals who had aided and abetted the CIA's cultural manipulations, novelist Richard Ellman detected a false blasé attitude, which makes everything seem alike, or as one expects, a kind of comme il faut for venality and corruption, which perceives the world as essentially a paradigm for boredom. Nothing is quite worth discerning, and nobody can be truly honest. 29. Renata Adler's Roman a Clef, Speedboat, captured the moral murkiness. Intelligent people, caught at anything, denied it. Faced with evidence of having denied it falsely, people said they had done it and had not lied about it, and didn't remember it, but if they had done it, or lied about it, they would have done it and misspoken themselves about it in an interest so much higher as to alter the nature of doing and lying altogether. 30. Primo Levi, in The Drowned and the Saved, offered a similar, though psychologically more sophisticated, insight. There are those who lie consciously, coldly falsifying reality itself, but more numerous are those who weigh anchor, move off, momentarily or forever, from genuine memories and fabricate for themselves a convenient reality. The silent transition from falsehood to deception is useful. Anyone who lies in good faith is better off, he recites his part better, he is more easily believed. 31. If those who took part in the cultural Cold War really believed in what they were doing, then they can't be said to have been consciously deceiving anybody. If it was all a fiction, a fabricated reality, it was no less true for that. Someone once said that if a dog pisses on Notre Dame, it doesn't mean there's anything wrong with the cathedral. But there's another proverb, one which Nicholas Nabokov was fond of quoting. You can't jump into the lake and come out dry. The democratic process, which Western cultural cold warriors rushed to legitimize, was undermined by its own lack of candor. The freedom it purveyed was compromised, unfree, in the sense that it was anchored to the contradictory imperative of the necessary lie. The context of the Cold War, as drawn up by the more militant intellectuals within the Congress for Cultural Freedom, was one where you operated under the sign of total fealty to an ideal. The ends justified the means, even if they included lying, directly or by omission, to one's colleagues. Ethics were subject to politics. They confused their role, pursuing their aims by acting on people's state of mind, choosing to slant things one way rather than another, in the hope of achieving a particular result. That should have been the job of politicians. The task of the intellectual should have been to expose the politician's economy with the truth, his parsimonious distribution of fact, his defense of the status quo. Pursuing an absolutist idea of freedom, they ended up by offering another ideology, a freedomism, or a narcissism of freedom, which elevated doctrine over tolerance for heretical views. And of course, true freedom is actually a better name than freedom tout court, says Anthony in Eyeless in Gaza. Truth, it's one of the magical words. Combine it with the magic of freedom and the effect's terrific. Curious people don't talk about true truth. I suppose it sounds too queer. True truth, true truth. No, it obviously won't do. It's like berry berry or wagga wagga. 32,